Greetings, friends! We are officially halfway through our week-long Parasite Probe. I hope that you're having as much fun as I am. Once you get into this topic, it tends to feel a lot like a can of worms. No pun intended. There are so many different layers to this, and I hope after today you'll start to get a sense of that. So, we have talked about the fact that we likely have more parasitic presence than we think in the developed world. We've talked about why the doctor often misses them and how they can impact our nutrition. But what do they do to our overall health, to our physical bodies? So in many ways, today we'll answer the question, why the heck should we even care if we have parasites? All right, so let's get going. Parasites can have three major types of impact on our body and on our health. The first way they impact us is by fundamentally altering our immune system, and this actually makes us more susceptible to all kinds of pathogens and allergens. The second way they impact us is by damaging our tissue, both directly with their bodies and indirectly via the toxic chemicals that our own bodies spray around them to try to fight them off. And finally, what I contend is perhaps the most important impact on our bodies, they act as toxicity sponges and chronically leak harmful matter into our bloodstreams. All right, so let's examine all three of these more closely, starting with immune alteration. Our immune system has many different arms that expand and contract according to the stimuli that we are exposed to. So two of the most well-studied arms of the immune system are the Th1 and Th2 immune responses. Th stands for T helper cells, which is a kind of immune cell, but that's not very important. All that you need to understand about this is that an optimal immune state is when these two arms, Th1 and Th2, are balanced. This balance will afford us the most defensive power against the most diverse array of intruders. Conversely, when these arms are imbalanced, it can result in being vulnerable to certain kinds of intruders. Like we mentioned yesterday, parasites are infamous for skewing the balance between Th1 and Th2, and actually, depending on the kind of parasite, it can result in a different kind of imbalance. So helminths, or worms, are known to lower the Th2 response, which is the response that we need to fight off things like viruses and bacteria as well. And they also increase the Th1 response, which is associated with autoimmunity. Meanwhile, protozoans, or microscopic parasites, are known to increase the Th2 response, but to lower the Th1 response, which, remember, we need to fight off worms. So, in either scenario, the chronic presence of these kinds of parasites results in an immune system that is suboptimal and more vulnerable to different kinds of infection. Not good. This is part of why we address parasites so early on in the healing journey, so that your immune system can start to normalize and have a better chance of fighting off whatever infections or toxins may be present. So, before I go any further, I do want to do a little bit of myth busting here. So, maybe you've heard some headlines about how parasites can actually lower your inflammation. There have been some emerging studies that show the ingestion of parasites as being associated with less autoimmunity and lower inflammation. So we're going to talk about more reasons why this is a horrible idea later on, but first, let's just think about why this is a bad idea through the lens of inflammation. When our body's immune systems are fighting something off, they purposely cause inflammation. It's necessary. As you can see, the most common culprits for causing inflammation are intruders and toxins, pathogens, chemicals, radiation, and foreign objects that cause damage. These are all things that we actually really need our immune systems to work on, to get out of our bodies. And that process requires inflammation. So, when we use ibuprofen or other artificial means to shut these inflammation pathways off, we're actually shutting off the fight against these intruders and basically surrendering, letting them cause damage and take up residence. Now, if parasites were actually going to get to the root cause of inflammation in our bodies, by, say, destroying these pathogens or toxins and healing up our injuries, then I would be all for using them to lower inflammation. But instead, what we find is that parasites, much like ibuprofen, shut off inflammation by simply shutting off a huge swath of the immune system. So you tell me, do you think that shutting off the immune system is actually good for us in the long run? I'd say absolutely not. So you may have also heard of people purposely ingesting things like tapeworms for weight loss, like the woman in this article here. And immune alteration is just one of the reasons I would never suggest doing this. It may sound like a great idea in the short term, but long term, these guys will give you trouble through altering your immune system and making you more susceptible to other infections, as well as potentially causing tissue damage and increasing your systemic toxicity, both of which we'll talk about more in a minute. Okay, so hopefully the immune alteration component of this is pretty clear. If you know that you deal with immune dysregulation of any type, maybe autoimmunity, then definitely do not overlook parasite presence. A parasite may be what is causing your immune imbalance. Next, let's look at tissue damage that parasites can often cause. So, just the physical presence of things like worms in your body can create damage to your tissue. But parasites can also release chemicals that result in unpleasant symptoms. So, worm activity of all kinds can cause blockages in your organs like the intestines, liver, bile duct, and lymphatics. They can lead the body to create large, fluid filled cysts in the liver, lungs, brain, or other body cavities. Many chemicals from parasites can result in neurological types of symptoms. They, of course, can cause physical and chemical damage to the mucosa and gut lining. And then we talked yesterday about different kinds of anemias that parasites can cause, which make us more vulnerable to tissue damage in general. Some parasites can migrate through the tissue and cause damage doing that. Neoplasia or irregular tissue growth is a common outcome of parasite presence when the body is trying to cope. Often, the body is so hyperstressed by their presence that you can also become hypersensitive and react to everything from food to your environment. Edema and joint pain as a result of your own immune response to them, and the atrophying of the villi absorption structures in the intestines are also very common. So, maybe you've noticed in hearing about these types of tissue damage that these signs and symptoms are incredibly common in chronic illness of all kinds. This, my friends, is why it is so important to rule out parasites first before you are diagnosed with a condition and go down a life-altering path. It's possible there is a more simple explanation. So, one of the most common ways that I see tissue damage and blockage from parasites is in the gallbladder. And this is often with biliary dysfunction that is incredibly stubborn and doesn't respond well to supplementing. So, as this paper illustrates, strongyloides, threadworm, can physically block the bile ducts, causing irregularities. And this has also been documented with liver flukes. So this paper shows that liver flukes physically blocking the bile ducts can cause biliary inflammation and make it very susceptible to infection with the bacteria E. coli. So it's really important that we rule out parasites before doing any intensive bile work, as no amount will be effective without removing the parasites and restoring the structural function there. So, just one example of a common way I see tissue damage in my practice. So, beyond the worms themselves, the immune response to the parasites can cause tissue damage as well. We see this in worms that are present in the GI being attacked, which can result in damage to the peristalsis movements that we use to move food through. And this can result in slower transit time. Likewise, attacking the tissue near the rectum, where worms like to hang out, can result in rectal prolapse. And then hyperplasia, or enlarged bile ducts, is another common manifestation of the immune system attacking the parasites that are there. So these are just a few of the most common forms of damage, but really the possibilities are endless here. All right, so now we come to my favorite part of all of this, which is toxicity. So, what we'll find is that even though the other two prongs of this are incredibly important, toxicity is really the ultimate way that parasites compromise our health and can result in so many different kinds of chronic illnesses and conditions. Toxicity is the ultimate root cause. So let's start out here with a little bit of a metaphor. Say you have a barrel where your body is storing all of its toxins so that they can't damage your tissue. So all of them are better in one easy place because it's more manageable that way. So this is all well and good until your toxicity bucket gets so full that it begins to leak and spill out into your tissue, where it can begin to do a lot of damage. Now, say around this time, your body is ingesting some sponges, which it usually just allows to pass through without incident. But since your body is compromised with all of this toxicity that it doesn't know how to control or get a handle on, your body decides, hey, what if instead of getting rid of the sponges this time, I actually use them? They can help me clean up this spill. So, your body allows the sponges to stay inside, and they do indeed sop up most of the toxins. So now all of the toxins are in one place in each sponge. However, the sponges themselves are super toxic, but at least the problem is consolidated and more easy to contain. So now your body has less of an acute problem, but it does have to deal with this chronic presence of toxic sponges in its tissue. So, what are the sponges in this scenario? Any guesses? That's right, they're worms. Parasitic worms. As we'll see, worms are actually incredible toxicity sponges that can gobble up and absorb all kinds of dangerous stuff. So, beyond just worrying about what these guys might do to our nutrition, our immunity, and our tissue, we also need to worry about the fact that they are likely filled to the brim with nasty, toxic sludge. So, what kind of toxic sludge? Literature has shown that parasites contain significant amounts of pathogenic bacteria of many different types and kinds. We mentioned E. coli, also Lyme, and its co-infections have been found to survive and hide in parasites. So if you've been diagnosed and struggle with chronic Lyme disease, tend to your parasites where that stuff is living, eh? Parasites can also eat their weight in heavy metals. They contain pollutants and chemicals from our environment in very high concentrations. Mold and fungus love parasites. And of course, viruses are highly associated with parasite presence in literature. Okay, so let's kind of back some of this up with a look at a few papers. So, scientists using state-of-the-art molecular beacon DNA probes found that Lyme bacteria can hide and live inside of parasitic worms, and that this can cause chronic brain disease. So, they've also done autopsies on people with severe MS and have found these worms that contained Lyme bacteria in the nervous system, which suggested a causal relationship. So Lyme and parasites go together like PB&J. Antibiotics for that Lyme will not do the trick. You've got to get rid of the safe house by addressing the worm. In this paper, intestinal worms were found to accumulate heavy metals at concentrations that were quote unquote orders of magnitude higher than those in both the host tissue and in the environment. So, in other words, worms act like sort of a magnet for metals and have exponentially higher levels inside of them than we do in the rest of our body, but also in our surroundings. And this was also true for a few forever chemicals that they looked at in this paper. So PCBs are a kind of highly toxic compound that persists for many years in the environment. And these were found to be in much higher concentration in worms than in their fish hosts. And what was so interesting about this is that the fish with worms were actually lower in these types of chemicals in their bodies and in their blood than the fish without worms. So this suggests that the worms themselves are actually providing a kind of service for the fish body by sopping these chemicals up and concentrating them in one place versus in the uninfected fish that had higher amounts that were everywhere and probably were causing more damage. So there's this sort of trade-off that we can extend to what happens in humans as well. Your body is sort of always making this choice. Do I want to deal with toxicity? Do I want to deal with infections that help to break down the toxicity? And I think that that's also a really important mindset piece for a lot of us, is to remember that our bodies are always trying to help us, trying to serve us. So pretty cool. All right, so this paper is actually just writing about what a perfect host nematodes or worms are for studying Candida, because Candida grows and lives so well inside of nematodes. They're considered the perfect model and environment for studying Candida. So they're actually just proposing that they use nematodes as a means to study Candida in the future in this paper. It also says that there is a very close morphological resemblance between nematode cells and mammalian intestinal cells, which I thought was very interesting. So if you have chronic Candida or any fungal issues, mold issues, worms are so good at growing this stuff that they're used as a model in science. So you are going to want to address parasites before you go on any crazy Candida diets. All right, so finally, this 2016 paper observed that virus-infected parasites can actually facilitate viral transfer to the human host, and that depending on which viruses may or may not be present with the parasite, the virulence of the infection will sort of vary. So viruses are actually a very important part of the parasite's establishment and life cycle in the host. So if you have chronic viral issues, things like EBV, HPV, etc., then you should definitely be thinking about parasites. All right, so now for the kicker. We've established that all of these things can and do live inside of parasites. So if you do have parasites, you don't just have one or two of these things. It's highly likely that you have everything on this list, that you have all of them, right? So the bigger the parasite gets, the more populous they get, the more that they're able to kind of sop up. And they can hold a lot of stuff. Really, whatever we're exposed to, they will hang on to it. So increasingly in modern life, we are exposed to all of this stuff. So eventually, these sponges and all of this nasty is likely going to catch up with us, right? And then just coming back to this poor woman who ingested a tapeworm on purpose, that tapeworm is going to cause so much more trouble than she thinks it is. And when I'm thinking about that, I am primarily thinking about this toxicity issue, although the other two issues are equally at play. All right, so we're actually going to continue to talk about toxicity in tomorrow's class, where we explain exactly why we can't keep these sponges in our bodies forever. But for now, hopefully you understand how all of this could potentially be dangerous. So now we know that parasites cause problems for our health by altering our immunity, causing tissue damage, and by acting as sponges for other toxins. So you should definitely never purposefully ingest a parasite. Enough said. And then we can see now why it's so important to address parasites first before tackling infections, viruses, or toxicity issues. So tomorrow, we're digging into this toxin topic and also explaining why we do need to be active in addressing this problem through parasite cleansing. So we can't just rely on our body's natural abilities to right the ship. And tomorrow we're talking all about why. So I will see you then.